a weak nominal GDP, okay, a weak nominal GDP estimate for a country indicates which of the following, okay. So this is a concept regarding nominal GDP. We know that GDP is calculated, the GDP prices we have both nominal GDP and real GDP. Nominal GDP, it is nothing but in nominal GDP we calculate, we take the current price, and in real GDP we take the constant price, that is the price prevailing in the base year. So the question is, we are having a weak nominal GDP. It means that the GDP is weak, the GDP growth, the nominal GDP growth is very low, okay. So what does it imply? A weak nominal GDP, what does it imply? So government debt seems more manageable, okay. So if you use some logic, okay, if the GDP growth is low, if the GDP growth is low means government's debt become difficult to manage, okay. So government debt, the government borrowing. So with lower GDP, tax collections will be lower and the revenue will be lower, and it will be very difficult for the government to manage the government debt. Currently, we are having a weak GDP, okay, whether it is nominal or real, we are having a weak GDP, and that is creating a big problem for the government to manage its debt. So it is difficult for the government debt. So managing government debt during this time is very difficult. So it cannot manage government debt during this time period. So first statement is wrong. It will result in lower pace of tax collection. Obviously, when the GDP growth is lower, tax collection will also be very lower. So second statement is right. So answer will be B, 2 only. Now, with reference to Indian economy, again another question regarding GDP, nominal GDP. The rate of growth of nominal GDP has steadily increased in the last decade. Okay, I have discussed many times in our classroom that if there is a question on the trend, whether in the last 5 years or in the last decade, if the rate of growth is steadily increasing or steadily decreasing, both the statements are wrong, because there is no consistent increase or there is no consistent decrease in relation to whether it is in relation to nominal GDP or in relation to real GDP. So rate of growth of nominal GDP is steadily increasing. If there is no steady increase, so first statement is wrong. The nominal GDP will be always lower than real GDP. So be very clear. Okay. Nominal GDP, I told you, nominal GDP, it is current price. Real GDP, it is constant price. That is base year, price prevailing in the base year. Now, see, normally, most of the time in India, nominal GDP will be higher than real GDP, because current price will be higher than the constant price. So normally India is a country which is having inflation. So a country which is having inflation, nominal GDP will be higher than real GDP. But if a country is having deflation, so if the country that is negative, the price rise going to negative, the price is falling down. So during deflation period, real GDP will be higher than nominal GDP, because this constant prices will be higher than current price. So we cannot say that nominal GDP will be always higher than real GDP. Only during inflation period, nominal GDP will be higher than real GDP. During deflation period, real GDP will be higher than nominal GDP. So the second statement, that nominal GDP will be always lower than real GDP. So the question is very, very clear. Okay. So in times of inflation, real GDP, okay, in times of inflation, real GDP will be lower than nominal GDP, or nominal GDP will be higher than real GDP. But during deflation, nominal GDP, real GDP will be higher than nominal GDP. So in this question, what it is saying, that nominal GDP will be always lower than real GDP. No, normally, what is the situation? Nominal GDP will be higher than real GDP. Why? Because of inflation. But during deflation, nominal GDP will be lower than real GDP. Okay, only during deflation only nominal GDP will be lower than real GDP. So this statement is also, be very clear, don't get confused, be very clear, what is nominal GDP, what is real GDP. When real GDP will be higher, so normally in India, nominal GDP is higher than real GDP. Reason is because of inflation. But during deflationary period, what can happen? Real GDP can be higher than nominal GDP. So this statement saying that nominal GDP will be always, so be very clear, nominal GDP, most of the time nominal GDP is higher than real GDP, but during deflationary period, nominal GDP will be lower than real GDP. Okay, so that concept you be very clear. So questions regarding nominal GDP.